Good afternoon, everyone. You're stuck with me again as chair. I know, boo, shame. I do call this meeting to order, and welcome to meeting number 14 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Canadian Heritage. I'd like to acknowledge that this meeting is taking place on the unceded traditional territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. Pursuant to the motion adopted by this committee on Monday, January 31, 2022, this meeting is taking place on the study of the Status of the Artist Act and its impact on improving basic working conditions for artists. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the House Order of November 25, 2021, and members are attending in person in the room and remotely using the Zoom application. I'm going to skip over the part about people who are attending in the room. I think we all know those rules. For members attending by Zoom, I will recognize you by name before speaking and click on the microphone icon to activate your mic. And please mute yourself when you are not speaking. Interpretation for those on Zoom, you have the choice at the bottom of your screen of either floor, English, or French. And for those of you in the room, you know what to do. For those on Zoom, raise your hand if you wish to speak. If you lose interpretation, please raise a point of order as quickly as possible. And in accordance with a routine motion, all witnesses have completed the required connection tests in advance of the meeting. We will now begin with opening comments and opening statements. Each group will have 5 minutes to speak, and that can be divided up with different witnesses within that group. But we will begin with the Department of Canadian Heritage, and that will be represented by Thomas Owen Ripley and Kelly Beaton with the Department of Canadian Heritage. The floor is yours for 5 minutes. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Bon après-midi à tous.
Good afternoon, everyone. I would also like to thank you for inviting us here to speak with you today.
Joining you too from the unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. La loi sur le statut de l'art.
Canada's Status of the Artist Act was born of the recognition that the road traveled by artists is a difficult one. Despite the value of their work in our lives and societies, many artists must fight for the income and working conditions they deserve. The Act was passed in 1992, but its origins date back to 1980, when UNESCO issued its recommendation concerning the status of the artist, which recognized the atypical ways in which artists earn their living and proposed measures that UNESCO member states could take to improve the socioeconomic situation of artists. Canada's Status of the Artist Act consists of two parts. The first part outlines a set of general provisions and is the responsibility of the Minister of Canadian Heritage. The first part serves as the basis for the second part of the Act, which establishes a framework to govern the professional relationship between artists and federally regulated producers. This second part is the responsibility of the Minister of Labour. The general provisions of Part 1 include a recognition of the important role that artists play in our lives, our society, and our economy, and links this recognition to the importance of artists receiving compensation for the use of their work and having a social status that reflects the weight of their contribution to society. This recognition of the richness that artists bring to the lives of Canadians and of our collective responsibility to recognize and fairly compensate for these contributions is at the heart not only of the Status of the Artist Act, but also of what we strive to achieve at the Department of Canadian Heritage.
Events of recent times have only highlighted the importance of these objectives. There's no getting around the devastation of the pandemic on the arts sector. We've heard from performing arts centers, theater and dance companies, cultural hubs, arts training institutions, artists and technician unions, and other partners since their world and ours came crashing down 2 years ago. We've seen the numbers. We know from labor force survey data that 2020 saw a 29% decrease in hours worked by self-employed artists, the lowest level on record. We know from our own survey at the Department of Canadian Heritage of Canadian artists and content creators that 62% experienced a loss in income since the outbreak of COVID-19. We heard Sophie Préjean, president of Union des Artistes, report to this committee in February that 40% of that organization's membership had considered or were still considering leaving their artistic careers in the long term. These are times of unprecedented need, and throughout the pandemic, the department has worked hard to disperse funds to help keep the arts and culture organizations that hire and support artists afloat. And we know that these investments are having positive effects. The department recently conducted a survey of approximately 10,000 recipients of the $500 million COVID Emergency Support Fund. More than 3 out of 4 of every respondent, 77%, indicated that the fund helped their organization remain in operation. And almost every respondent, 95%, indicated that they were satisfied with the timeliness with which the funds were dispersed. We can also see that arts, culture, and heritage sectors are starting to bounce back from the pandemic's impacts. And we can now focus our efforts on supporting the recovery of those sectors hardest hit by the pandemic. For example, through the recently launched $60 million Performing Arts Workers Resilience Fund, which will deliver direct financial support and supportive programming to arts workers through the guilds, unions, and associations that are closest to them. Même si la plupart des travailleurs
While most workers and workplaces in the cultural sector are governed by provincial or territorial labour legislation, the Canadian Status of the Artist Act remains an important instrument for protecting the rights of artists through collective bargaining. And, in its general provisions, it enshrines the crucial recognition of all that artists contribute to our country. It is a tool to support artists and creators, but the overriding goal is to ensure that artists are supported, fairly compensated, and given the status they deserve in return.
Je vous remercie.
Thank you.
Miigwech.
Thank you, Mr. Ripley, and that was almost exactly on time, so it's like you practiced that beforehand. That's great. Next up, we have the Canada Industrial Relation Boards, and that would be represented by Jeanette Brazeau, chairperson of the board. Madame Brazeau, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the committee for the invitation. La loi sur le statut de l'artiste.
The Status of the Artist Act was passed in 1992 and enacted in 1995, so just over 25 years ago. Part 2 of this act establishes a framework for collective bargaining between self-employed artists and producers who wish to retain their services for a given project. The purpose of the act was to allow for the negotiation of framework agreements between artists' associations and the producers in order to establish basic employment conditions for designated sectors. The federal Status of the Artist Act is limited in scope. In other words, it only applies when the producer is a federal institution, such as a federal department or agency, like the National Film Board, or when it is a broadcasting undertaking as defined by the CRTC, so TVA, Radio-Canada, CTV, etc. The Act is largely inspired by the Canada Labour Code with respect to the process for certifying artists' associations as bargaining agents and the terms and conditions for collective bargaining. However, there are specific distinctions that are necessary to adapt to the realities of the artistic milieu and to the nature of the relationship between producers and the independent workers, the artists.
Where the Act also established a specialized tribunal to deal with these matters, the Canadian Artists and Producers Professional Relations Tribunal, or CAPRIT for short. Legislative amendments were made in 2012 that abolished that tribunal and assigned a responsibility for Part 2 of the Act to the Canada Industrial Relations Board. I was the executive director of the board at the time and was directly involved in that transition. The board immediately initiated consultations with the artistic community in an effort to develop and adopt procedural regulations that govern the handling of the cases that were to be filed with the board under the Act. This resulted in the adoption of the Status of the Artist Act procedural regulations in 2014, which provides transparency on how these matters are processed before the board. The former tribunal, CAPRIT, was very active in the early years following the coming into force of the Act. The tribunal was called upon to define the various sectors and to certify the various associations as the representatives of artists in those sectors. There are currently 26 sectors that are recognized under the Act and for which an association is certified to represent the artists in those sectors. The board maintains a register of certifications issued under the Status of the Artist Act, which is available on our website. There is now limited activity under the Act. The board has only received 8 applications or complaints under the Act since 2013, when the duties were transferred to the board. When an application or complaint is received, we immediately assign a board officer to engage with the parties involved, to assist in clarifying the issues that need to be addressed, and to gather the necessary information for the board to be able to make a determination. In some cases, the matter is resolved through a mediated settlement. I am aware that previous witnesses who appeared before the committee expressed the importance of having complaints or applications dealt with expeditiously. I can inform the committee that the median processing time for all matters that come before the board is just under 6 months, and that's from the date of filing to final determination. Some cases may take longer, depending on the issue being raised, whether a hearing is necessary, and the availability of the participants in the process. We certainly strive to provide timely and effective dispute resolution services. As the tribunal is responsible for interpreting and applying the provisions of the Act, I will be careful not to take a position on policy issues, but I will be pleased to respond to any questions you may have. And thank you for the opportunity.
Merci beaucoup, Madame.
Thank you very much, Ms. Brazo.
Prochain témoin.
Our next witness is Mr. Simon Brault, the director and CEO of the Canada Council for the Arts.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Brault.
Thank you very much, Mr. Brault. The floor is yours for 5 minutes. Thank you. Good day, everyone. I would like to begin by thanking the committee for your work and for inviting me today. The Canada Council for the Arts plays a fundamental role in supporting the Canadian arts ecosystem as a whole. For over 60 years, we have provided grants to individual artists to support the creation and the sharing of their work. We also support hundreds of arts organizations to help present, promote, and disseminate the work of Canada's various artists. Over the year 2021-2022, the tax year that has just ended, the Council provided $314 million in grants through its regular programs and over $141 million in additional emergency funding to try to limit the devastating impacts of the pandemic on the arts sector.
Has highlighted imbalances and inequities, it is important to understand that these precarities have existed for decades. The work that artists do is often misunderstood and frequently does not align well with how labor is valued in our society. There is a combination of factors that make the arts sector different. First, there is a precarious freelance, seasonal, or gig work. Second, there is an objective need for an excess of artists, artistic proposals, and offerings compared to the immediate demand. It is this very excess of talent that ensures that we have a diverse, thriving arts sector. It is the same imbalance of supply and demand that has led to stark competition among artists for limited resources or work. Third, unlike most workers in our economy, many artists will continue to create, write, rehearse, and train regardless of whether there is a promise of monetary compensation at the end of their efforts. Artists and writers are fueled by passion and a thirst for creation, not only compensation. Many artists are working all the time, thinking, experimenting, training, and so on, usually without any kind of remuneration. It has become the norm that artists should engage in unpaid, invisible labor. This combination of factors illustrates why traditional economic models of labor, wages, and social supports does not work so well for the arts sector, and why more inclusive models to support artists should be explored. The Council will continue to directly fund thousands of artists and writers, which in turn contributes to the economic growth of the arts sector. To illustrate, in the year that just concluded, the Council awarded $128 million to over 4,600 artists in grant funding. Out of these artists, almost 50% of them were first-time recipients receiving a total of $50 million. While the Canada Council supports the arts ecosystem in a broad sense, we have no control over the mechanisms and systems that are currently in place, such as employment insurance, income tax, and legislation like the Status of Artists Act that directly impact working conditions. As a recent UNESCO report entitled Reshaping Policies for Creativity, the pandemic highlighted that a stronger social safety net for artists is needed more than ever, and that there are multiple avenues worth exploring.
At the Council, we openly recognize that there is much to be done to make our society more supportive of an arts sector which contributes so greatly to the quality of life of every one of us. At this time, we are asking ourselves some fundamental, courageous, and complex questions that will have a profound impact on our work in the years to come. We are resolutely committed to the path to decolonize minds, to make the arts sector more inclusive, representative, equitable, and sustainable. At the Council, we are reflecting on the historical assumptions that underlie our work. We are aware of the importance of moving beyond a Eurocentric view of the arts. What does it mean to be a professional artist? How should we define excellence or artistic merit? What is or isn't art? We are pondering these and many other questions, and we seek answers with artists and the diverse communities from which they come. The pandemic has shown beyond any doubt that society needs art and culture. Imagine what we would have experienced during the long weeks of lockdown without music, reading, fiction on TV, or on the internet. But the same pandemic also made the lives of artists more precarious. Let's not forget there is no art without artists. Thank you. I will be pleased to answer your questions.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur.
Thank you very much, Mr. Brault.
We'll now begin our first round of questioning. This is a 6-minute round that includes both the questions and the responses. The first round is the Conservative round, and that is Mr. Waugh for 6 minutes. Mr. Waugh, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Chair, and welcome everyone to our committee today. Soon, as you can tell. Welcome Canadian Heritage. Once again, Mr. Ripley, along with Ms. Beaton, thank you for attending this Status of the Artist Act. 1992, it was brought in. 10 years later, we had an extensive review. Do you foresee another review coming? Since the last review really was 2002.
Mr. Chair, may I?
Yeah, sorry,
yes, go
I
ahead.
didn't direct it to anyone, so it would be either you, Owen, or Ms. Beaton. I'm sorry for that.
Yes, so thank you for the question, Mr. Waugh. So you are right. There was a review of the Act 7 years after it came into force, and at the time, there was no. The report found that generally speaking, things were working well, and there were no major recommendations to change the Act at the time. It's certain that we engage regularly with stakeholders in the arts and culture sector to hear about their concerns. At this time, there is no work plan to modify the Act, but we are certainly cognizant that the committee is looking at the question and will be following with interest any recommendations the committee ultimately decides to put forward.
Yeah, it seems a little odd because it's 20 years since, from 2002, you didn't make many changes, if at all, any then. And now 20 years later, you really can't see, you're expecting maybe another evaluation, but you don't think there'll be any changes?
So I think a couple of things are relevant, Mr. Watt. One is that, the concepts in the Act are relatively flexible in that, the concept of artist as defined is quite broad and captures a wide, a wide slice of artists and creators, even as technology has evolved. And the second piece, and I think I spoke to it, and my colleague Jeanette spoke to it a little bit as well, is that the federal status of the Artists Act is only one piece of the puzzle, and perhaps a smaller piece at that, because with respect to labor law more broadly, and then with respect to status of the Artists Acts at the provincial level, those would be the pieces of legislation that govern anything not considered to be a federal producer, so to speak. So those pieces of legislation are quite critical to kind of understanding the bigger puzzle, I would say.
No, you're right on. I'll move for the Canada Council of the Arts. Mr. Brolt, you had a lot of numbers there, 314 million in grants, 141 million in additional grants. I take it that you handed out in the last year or so. What was the process for getting that money out? Did you first look at new ones or old ones, or was it only the past recipients that actually got the first kick of the cat at the money, if you so choose?
Thank you for the question. Usually, the way we distribute money is through a jury process. So artists or organizations apply to the Canada Council, and juries made of specialists of artists are assessing each demand and decide how and what money will be received. During the pandemic, since last year and the year before, we also had a lot of money that was added by government to support the sector that was in a very difficult situation. And what we did is we established a balance between supporting what we call the core funded clients of the Canada Council. So these are the organizations who will normally receive operating grants from the council, and that money was basically top-up money. So we counted on the previous assessment, and we gave a portion of their regular grants to those organizations. But during the pandemic, we also insisted that the Canada Council would continue to use the juries in order to support what I would call the independent scene. So that's the artists and collective of artists across Canada who are still trying to work and to create. And I'm very proud to say that we reached the highest level of support during that pandemic. And in fact, that, as I said in my notes, more than 50% of the artists receiving a grant were first-time recipients. So never, ever before they got money from the Canada Council. So I think we succeeded to cast a very wide net in order to cover and make sure that the entire sector, and make sure that it would be still a lot of artistic and literary creation during that pandemic. And actually, all Canadians will see that work now, that it will be presented. So I hope.
So gig work, that, if I can, gig work or freelance, that certainly has gone up in your business, I would say, over the years. And just talk to that if you don't mind, because I think many people are just on semi-contracts. They go from job to job to job.
And Mr. Bro, if you could do that in about 25 seconds or less, that would be great.
Yes, actually, you're right. I mean, we have in the art sector, some artists are working for permanently for companies like in Stratford or other big companies, but most of the artists are moving from a project to another, and that's their reality. And in between those projects, they're trying to survive and to continue to work and to continue to be ready to work. So that's the reality of artists, you're right.
Thank you, Mr. Waugh, and thank you, Mr. Bro, as well. Kudos for getting in a Stratford reference in there. Mr. Lewis, you now have the floor for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all of our panelists for being here today and expressing the importance of what you're doing. Maybe I would continue just that line with Monsieur Bro. You mentioned, and this was a question I was going to ask you, so I'll move on this. 50% of the recipients were first-time, that balance between core-funded and first-time recipients. I know that had been a barrier previously, that artists had difficulty getting, independent artists had difficulty getting grants. My question was written down before you testified here, is that, did you have a rough breakdown of the amounts of grants, the sizes of the organizations and the applicants that apply? But what I'm seeing is that it sounds like these independent artists are getting the same opportunities, because in my experience, those smaller financial supports to independent artists have a compounded beneficial results. So with the newer model that you've had in the past year, would you consider using that same model moving forward?
Thank you for the question. Absolutely. Actually, over the years, and especially over the last 2 years, we created a system at Canada Council by which people apply, their demands are assessed, and we support their demands on a merit base. But we also make sure that we calibrate the level of success from a region to another in order to make sure that no matter where you are, no matter where you are from, and no matter what you do, you need to have the same fair chance of getting supported by the Canada Council. And I'm very pleased to say that over the last years, we maintained the national success rate more or less equal across the country. So yes, it has been a good period for supporting more artists, and especially independent artists. And frankly, they are absolutely vital to the quality and the future of our sector.
Certainly glad to hear that. Thank you. In line with that, more artists are looking to technology to expand their careers, and the pandemic has highlighted the importance of that. Are there streams of funding through Canada Council of the Arts for training, specifically for digitalization, for promotion, that can help share our stories not only across Canada, as you mentioned, but also we are really strong at exporting our own talent to the world?
Absolutely, there are streams of funding for training. And I must say that during the pandemic, it has been an incredibly important laboratory all across the country for artists, no matter what they do, in order to master more digital capacities and production, dissemination, presentation. And I'm very encouraged to see that we are in a stronger position right now to offer quality product, even the people who are normally working on stages. And what we see now that the sector is recovering is that a lot of theater companies want to maintain an hybrid model, so offer obviously things on stage, but also give access to what they do through digital. So yes, I think we made very important progress over the last 2 years in terms of mastering digital in our sector.
Well, that's encouraging to hear. Thank you. Maybe I could direct my questions to Mr. Ripley at Canadian Heritage. Listening to our artists during the pandemic, besides listening to them and their art, listening to their feedback, as you just heard, is so important, and what lessons we can learn. So I'm quite grateful that you reached out to artists for the feedback during this pandemic, and maybe you could share a bit of that report, what kind of things we were hearing directly from artists, just like what was mentioned about theater possibly staying hybrid in the future.
So thanks for the question, Mr. Lewis. What I might share with the committee is, so the department had been planning to launch a survey of artists and creators just prior to the pandemic, and we pivoted once the pandemic hit to just adjust that survey to take into account the pandemic, so that we were really getting a texture from creators and artists. And so that it went out to about thousands of artists and creators, and we had about 4,700 reply. And I think some of the key takeaways from that is that we saw that a quarter of these artists report that their income from creative work fluctuates by at least 100% from year to year. Furthermore, 35% indicated that it could fluctuate from 50% year to year. We know that, the vast majority, a majority of these respondents, 57%, said that, they earn about, under $40,000 in pre-tax income. And that compares to a national pre-tax median of $71,000, for example. We know that the majority of them work in their creative profession part-time. These are entrepreneurs. They're business people. Very under a majority get to work in their creative profession full time. And the survey also highlighted that 62% of that 4,700 that replied, reported some loss of income during the pandemic, and that government support, whether that was at the provincial, territorial level or the federal level, was really critical to supporting them through it. So I hope that gives you a flavor, Mr. Lewis, but be happy to go into further detail.
It does. I wish I could, but I'm out of time. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ripley, and thank you, Mr. Lewis. Monsieur Champoux, vous avez la...
Mr. Champoux, the floor is yours for 6 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Ripley, don't go anywhere now. I think we're going to need you. So Mr. Waugh was questioning you, and you were talking about how there's no plan to amend the current federal Status of the Artist Act, but you were open to some of the suggestions heard at the committee, and that's very encouraging to hear. In a former version of the Act, there was an amendment made in 1992. The Minister of Heritage and the Minister of Labour conjointly were working on a revision, and is it a good idea to have that? Thank you, Mr. Champoux, for the question, and I am always available to the committee. As I mentioned in response to the prior question, currently, it is certainly a good idea to ensure that this act stays abreast of present trends. And certainly we are interested in recommendations that the committee may raise if there are certain factors that are no longer up to date. But I believe the fundamental principles of the Act still remain relevant. Question. It's because this Act was supposed to be updated quite some time ago, and I believe that it was supposed to be every 7 years. And we might ask you to include that requirement back into the Act. In 92, there was the Canadian Board of the Status of the Artist that was supposed to be put into place. Are you aware of it, and why was this not set up? Answer, yes, we are aware of it. My colleague Kelly is aware of the history of that board, so I will refer the question to her. Thank you very much, Owen, and thank you, Mr. Champoux. As you know, I believe it was in 1990, the government of the day decided to review all sorts of activities to make the system more efficient, and decided to do away with certain things that were not necessary. And it was decided that that board was not necessary. Looking at the discussions at the committee this week and over the past month at this committee and other committees, we have now a deeper understanding of issues. And as Owen mentioned, it is also part of our daily work in the contact we maintain with stakeholders, clients, and artists, and above all, our colleagues at the Canada Council for the Arts. So if there are issues, it's important that we be there and to know what we can do better. Question. In the testimony we've collected since the beginning of this study, many witnesses have talked about amending Part 2 of the Act to strengthen the negotiating power of parties. For example, when facing an adversary that's much more powerful than oneself, that there be a provision for binding arbitration so that negotiators could reach a framework agreement without it taking 5 years, as it did in some examples. Can you speak to that, Mr. Ripley or Ms. Beaton? Yes, thank you for the question, Mr. Champoux. The obligation to have a framework agreement is not a binding provision. So yes, witnesses were correct about that. Perhaps my colleague Ginette might have some observations to share with the committee. But what is for certain is that the responsibility of the party, of Part 2 rather, regarding framework agreements would be a question for our colleagues at the Department of Employment and Labor. But there are certain commitments in place. For example, in the mandate for the Minister of Labor, there is the requirement to look at self-employed workers and their situation. And the Labor Minister is meant to look into whether or not there is sufficient support in place for our independent or self-employed workers who do not receive employment insurance. So we certainly do work with our colleagues at those departments to ensure that artists and cultural workers are reflected in that work. I'm not sure if Ginette would like to add something.
We are unfortunately out of time for that round, but perhaps if Madame Brazeau wants a quick 20-second answer, I would allow that.
I would just add that binding arbitration for a first agreement or even subsequent agreements is not part of the current framework. Even if it is part of the Canada Labour Code, it is a political decision that must be made by the department. That would be the logical next step, given the experience that we have up to date with the Act as it is. Thank you very much.
Mr. Julian, you have the floor for 6 minutes.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chair, and thanks to our witnesses for being here today. And we hope that you and your families are staying safe and healthy as we now hit this sixth wave of the pandemic. And Mr. Ripley, I'd like to start with you. You did... you gave us an excellent presentation that talked about the unprecedented need of artists. And so I wanted to know internally within Canadian Heritage, to what extent Canadian Heritage is doing an analysis of what other countries are doing. We are seeing, for example, in countries like Ireland, putting in place basic income for artists. To what extent is Canadian Heritage monitoring these best practices in other countries, and what analysis have you done of these programs?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Julian. So we do monitor what goes on in other countries, and so my colleague Kelly's team, for example, does do a regular international scan. And you're correct that there has been movement in several jurisdictions looking at primarily pilot projects around support for artists and creators. You mentioned Ireland. There's a number of cities in the United States that have looked at pilot projects: San Francisco, St. Paul, Minnesota, New York State. Internationally, we also see France and New Zealand and Finland have also been looking at this issue. So we do that monitoring. It's the question of, again, a labor framework, and this is what I was trying to communicate to Mr. Champoux is not, we're certainly there to support our colleagues at ESDC as they reflect on these questions, but it's not a core responsibility for our minister. But we will work to make sure, obviously, that the interests of artists and creators are reflected as that reflection moves ahead post-pandemic.
Thank you. So do you do the second part of my question? You answered the first part completely, but the second part, the analysis that you do and the recommendations that you provide, when we see other countries moving forward with these kinds of supports for artists, and as you said in your presentation, there's an unprecedented need for artists and support right now. To what extent does the ministry actually do an evaluation and provide recommendations to the minister to suggest the advantages of some of these programs that have a proven track record?
We are doing that reflection, and some of the statistics and information I shared with Mr. Lewis go to that. We are working to understand the modern realities of artists and creators, and I think as Mr. Bro highlighted in his opening remarks, they do continue to be precarious. We've worked hard with the minister to support the pandemic emergency relief. We have a particular role in the ecosystem, primarily supporting arts and culture organizations, and then other institutions like Canada Council are their role is much more that direct support to artists. To your question, fundamentally, do there need to be changes to Canada Labour Code? Do there need to be changes, to the EI framework? Those aren't decisions for our minister. Those, are going to be, recommendations that the Minister of, Labour and Employment bring forward. But we will, and we are in contact with our colleagues in those departments because, to the point of this committee and the work that you're looking at, obviously artists and creators, do have an interest in those questions as we rethink some of these issues post-pandemic.
Merci. Maintenant, je vais aller.
Thank you. Next, I'll move to Ms. Brazeau. Ms. Brazeau, you said you couldn't make any political comments, but we were talking about the regulatory framework around this act. Many witnesses have raised the following: the idea of putting in place binding arbitration as a mandatory requirement so that artists would be on a more equal playing field within the private sector and also the federally regulated sector. Do you think that could be a valid recommendation to have binding arbitration be part of this act? Thank you for the question. Well, that certainly is a tool that exists in the Canada Labour Code. And we know that the Status of the Artist Act was inspired from the Canada Labour Code for many reasons at the time. The department decided not to include that provision. But now we have 25 years of experience with the Act. Would it be worthwhile to review that section and to draw this parallel with the Canada Labour Code in order to include binding arbitration for a first framework agreement? Well, it's a very good question. A question that I think should be carefully studied. This is a practice and a tool that does exist that could be integrated into the Status of the Artist Act, if that is what the study concludes, or if that is what the department concludes is a good approach to give the right tools to players. And you cannot take a position on that.
But perhaps we could come back to that in a future round. So that concludes our first round. I'm going to propose a quick second round, 4 minutes, 4 minutes, 2 minutes, and 2 minutes, if that's acceptable. Okay, so with that, we'll go 4 minutes to Mr. Uppel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, witnesses, for being here. I'm just going to start with Mr. Ripley. Just looking over, just getting some information here that over the last 4 mandate letters, even the last 4 annual departmental results reports, and the last 4 departmental plans of Canadian Heritage, we don't see the status of the Artist Act mentioned at all. Can you maybe just elaborate on that, about how much of a priority this is for the department, since considering it hasn't been mentioned at all?
Thank you for the question. So our role on it is that is to provide policy advice, primarily with respect to part 1 of the Act. That's the piece of the Act that our minister is responsible for, and that is if you look in the Act, it's principle-based language that primarily reflects the value that artists bring to society and the recognition that they deserve for their contributions. That sets the framework and kind of the policy statement that then flows into part 2. But part 2 is not under the responsibility of our minister. So the reality is our day-to-day role for the status of the Artist Act is a limited one, in that my colleague Jeanette, who's at the table, has the job of kind of overseeing the day-to-day implementation of it, and the Minister of Labor is more broadly responsible for any kind of policy decisions affecting that Part 2 framework.
Okay, thank you. It's been quite established. I mean, that what is art, who is artist, has obviously always been changing. But I think just because of digital new technology, that's been that much more now. How is your organization, and this question is also not only for Canadian Heritage, but the other organizations as well, that how is your organization changing, and also how are you reaching out to artists who are non-traditional artists? I know, Mr. Ripley, you mentioned the survey that you are doing, and also what more can you do to ensure that not only their views are heard, but also that you're taking action to ensure that they are also supported by your organization?
So perhaps I can start, and then Monsieur Bro might also want to jump in. So indeed, you referenced the survey. We made a really intentional effort to include online creators in our outreach for that survey, so that their input was included. And we do, and I believe my colleague Kelly spoke to this. We do make effort to engage with stakeholders on a regular basis, and also reach out and hear from those who are not not regular clients of the department, because to your point, that is important to make sure that the programs and policies of the department remain aligned with today's reality. We're at an exciting moment in time where there is a lot of change taking place, and so there's a real opportunity to make sure that the policies and the programs that the department is responsible for does reflect the needs of new creators, or creators who feel that the way that those programs or policies are currently structured do not reflect their needs or interests. And so we're certainly happy to continue to engage with them to make sure that their input is taken on board.
And we're going to leave that there.
We're going to leave it there? Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Uppel. Ms. Hepfner for 4 minutes.
Thanks very much. And I'll pick up where my colleague Mr. Uppel left off. But first of all, Mr. Ripley, we keep talking about this survey that your department did, and I'm wondering if you have some sort of summary or report that came out of that survey. Maybe you can provide it to the committee so we can have use of it for our study. And next, I'd like to ask you also about digital creators. And this question might be prefaced on whether or not Bill C-11 receives royal assent, but I'm wondering if digital producers could be considered producers under the SAA. Could the Status of the Artist Act possibly serve as a model for collective bargaining for digital producers?
So thank you for the questions. We'd be happy to share a high-level summary of the results of the survey. The actual data tables will be published in the next few months on the department's website, but we're happy to get you a high-level summary in the interim. On your second question, so as I believe I mentioned to Mr. Waugh at the beginning, the definition of artist is quite a broad one, and so our view would be that it includes it includes online creators. It includes those creators making content for digital platforms. The second piece of the puzzle is that they be independent, right? So the Status of the Artist Act doesn't apply to employer-employee relationships, but to independent artists. And so certainly it would apply to them, again, as long as the person that they were sitting across the table from was a federal producer within the meaning of that term.
So picking up on that, and maybe I'll direct this question to Ms. Brazo, because you sort of talked about how it's a federal legislation and it doesn't cover, the SAA doesn't cover all artists. There's also provincial and territorial legislation that comes into play for a lot of artists. Can you talk about that division of power and maybe the need for other legislation at the provincial and territorial level as well?
Thank you for the question. So you're absolutely right. There is a distinction between the federal and the provincial producers, and the Status of the Artist Act applies uniquely and solely to the federal producers, and that's defined very clearly in the Act. It has to be a broadcasting entity that's regulated by the CRTC, or a department or a federal organization that's in the Privacy Act, listed in the Privacy Act. So those are very circumscribed list of entities that are covered by the Act. We know that the Quebec province has a similar statute. Other provinces have I think we have 2 other provinces that have similar models. If the artists are to access a collective bargaining regime, they would fall under, the majority of them would fall under the provincial jurisdiction. And so they would certainly benefit from provincial regimes that are similar to the federal piece of legislation.
Thank you. I have 20 seconds left. Mr. Ripley, do you want to just pop in on that same question about the jurisdiction?
No, I think my colleague Ginette did a good job of summarizing it. That the flip side of this is that many of the kinds of working relationships that artists and creators enter into would fall under provincial jurisdiction, and we see that there's a robust regime in Quebec that's the Quebec government's currently studying changes to it. It probably has one of the more it has the most robust regime at the provincial level. As Ginette mentioned, there are a couple of other provinces and some that are thinking about it, but those are really important pieces of the puzzle.
And we do have to leave it there. Monsieur Champoux, pour 2 minutes.
Mr. Champoux for 2 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And congratulations to Lisa for having asked a question to Mr. Ripley with only 20 seconds. Very agile. A very agile way to use all the time. I have a question for Mr. Ripley or for the other colleagues from the department. Currently, a producer can receive a grant from the government, but without guaranteeing basic working conditions for artists. Do you think this is something that should remain? Could the Department of Heritage correct this? Thank you for the question, Mr. Champoux. My colleague, Kelly, who manages a number of arts programs, is probably in a better position to answer this question. Thank you, Owen. Just to confirm, as you asked, Mr. Chapu, that this act only applies to federally regulated entities. So this would be, for example, broadcasters that fall under CRTC regulation, among others. On your question of how to improve this situation, in order to improve working conditions and to ensure that artists' rights are respected, that we have mechanisms in place to deal with conflicts or difficult situations. We also have 26 associations that have been certified as negotiating agents. Okay, I just have a few seconds left, so I would like to ask a question to Mr. Brault. Earlier, I talked about the status of the artist board, which is not in place. Do you think that it would be useful for such a board to be reinstated? What is your view on that? Well, to be quite frank, I believe the situation is extremely complex. When I look at arts across Canada, we have the system of federal acts, the system of provincial acts, and what we do now at the Canada Council, when we support an organization, we make sure that the organization submits written confirmation that it will be respecting all levels of acts to provide optimal health and safety conditions, etc., for artists. And when or if we see that it is not the case, we can intervene and we can issue a warning to an organization and we can cut funding. Those are the types of responses we can use in response. But it's very difficult for me to speak to whether or not there's one part or another of a given act that would remedy this extremely complex situation with people working in so many different sectors. Thank you, Mr. Brault. Mr. Julian.
Questioner of this round for 2 minutes, please.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. Je vais venir à Monsieur Brault, du Conseil des arts du Canada. Il y a deux.
I have a question for Mr. Brault from the Canada Council for the Arts. First of all, we have heard raised basic income for artists. We know this exists in other countries. A number of witnesses have discussed the problems that exist for artists. So here are my questions. First, my question for the Canada Council for the Arts. Do you think it would be advisable to follow these best practices in other countries and to provide basic income for our artists? And secondly, as it pertains to the status of the Artists Act, do you think it would be worthwhile to have binding arbitration included in the Act to level the playing field between artists and the organizations? Thank you very much for the questions. I won't answer the second question because it really is beyond my expertise. Regarding basic income for artists, my colleague Owen, as my colleague Owen said, we are very closely following what is being done. So we look at other countries, we look at all sorts of different approaches that might make the situation more stable for artists. We know there are a number of pilot projects underway at present. And there also are programs, for example, in France that have been in place in France. This is a system that is based on the fact that they recognize that performing arts are a very intermittent form of labor. I find that to be a very worthwhile system to look into, but it is not the Department of Heritage's purview to look into this. But at the Canada Council of the Arts, I would say that we need to encourage improvements to be made because this is an extremely important sector in society and there are so many more employees than there are jobs. There is no labor shortage in the arts sector. Quite the contrary. The arts sector is based on this idea that there needs to be more art than there is demand for that art. And this is essential for us to have a captivating arts sector. We must find a way to remunerate artists more fairly instead of forcing them to jump from contract to contract and to go periods without working. Thank you very much.
For this first panel of witnesses, I want to thank all of our witnesses. Je remercie à tous nos témoins.
I'd like to thank all our witnesses for your comments today.
And very, very briefly, as we bring on the second panel of witnesses, and then we'll begin our second round. So thanks again, and we are suspended. Good afternoon. I will welcome everyone back to the second panel of witnesses of this Standing Committee on Canadian Heritage. To our witnesses, welcome. It's nice to have you with us today. Just as a quick word of welcome, interpretation services are available for both of you. At the bottom of your screen, you can choose Floor, English, or French, and if interpretation is lost at any time, please let us know as quickly as possible so we can remedy that. When speaking, please speak slowly and clearly. When you're not speaking, please have your microphone on mute. So we will begin our second panel of witnesses. Both witnesses have 5 minutes for opening comments, and then we will have our question periods. We will begin with Monsieur Philippe Beaulieu. And Monsieur Beaulieu, vous avez la parole pour...
The floor is yours for 5 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. The status of the Artist Act should recognize the legitimacy of businesses operated by professional artists. Expected profit is not the same for them as for any other business. Too often, their business status is questioned by the CRA because revenues are far less than expenses and operating losses are recurring. The income of professional artists consists primarily of grants, often in the form of scholarships, of royalties on their work, and the sale of work. Professional artists mainly rely on grants to create works or artistic projects, and these grants are awarded by peer committees set up by organizations such as the Canada Council for the Arts. This source of income is therefore highly variable from one year to the next, depending on the projects these artists submit to the organizations. As a result, their income depends on how much government assistance is granted, as the assistance often allows them to survive and create in sometimes very difficult financial conditions. The CRA should familiarize itself more with how this type of business operates in order to better understand the nature of its revenues. Grants for artistic projects should be subject of a separate tax slip or have their own box on a T4A slip in order to avoid any confusion on taxing and reporting this type of income, both for professional artists and tax preparers at the CRA. Currently, grants and bursaries are reported in the same box on the T4A slip. These grants should be reported on the T2125 form and not on line 13010 where scholarships are reported. A specific deduction should be allowed for grants that have been cashed out, but for which there are still expenses to be incurred. Currently, professional artists find themselves paying taxes on any balance of grants received that have expenses remaining in the following year. The pandemic has exacerbated this phenomenon because of the closure of creating centers, which delays the completion of funded projects. The revision of the Status of the Artist Act should be accompanied by new tax measures to support professional artists in their practice and to encourage the public to consume Canadian cultural products, which contributes directly to the health of this industry. Some of these measures are already in place at Revenu Quebec. A copyright tax deduction could be offered on the royalties generated by the works of professional artists in order to reduce part of the taxation of this income. Since a professional artist's income varies considerably depending on the projects he or she undertakes, the purchase of an income averaging annuity should be offered to reduce the taxation of any exceptionally high income by spreading this income over several tax years. To encourage the consumption of cultural products, the CRA should allow accelerated capital cost allowance for the purchase of works of art by Canadian artists by businesses that wish to support professional artists. Currently, tax law provides for a 20% capital cost allowance rate for this type of property. The purchase of season tickets with at least 3 performances should be 100% deductible as an entertainment expense for businesses. A tax credit for the purchase of cultural property should be made available to all taxpayers to encourage the consumption of our culture in Canada. Finally, the construction of government and municipal buildings should require, by order, that 1% of the total budget be allocated to the purchase of art created by professional artists who could apply to public art competitions across the country. And those are my observations from my practice as a chartered professional accountant for professional artists in Canada.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Mr. Beaulieu. That was exactly 5 minutes. Thank you so much.
Prochain témoin.
Our next witness is Mr. Costa Dimitrikopoulos with the Canada Revenue Agency. The floor is yours for 5 minutes. Thanks very much.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the invitation to appear before you today. My name is Costa Dimitrikopoulos et je suis le directeur général.
And I am the Director General of the Income Tax Rulings Directorate in the Legislative Policy and Regulatory Affairs Branch within the Canada Revenue Agency.
Pleased to answer any questions you may have regarding the general taxation of artists. In my remarks today, I will be providing the committee with a general overview of this topic. To set a helpful context for today's discussion, I'd like to briefly describe the role of the CRA. As you may know, the Department of Finance is responsible for developing and evaluating federal tax policy and amending the Income Tax Act. As administrator, the CRA is responsible for the functions that implement the Income Tax Act, including providing information to the public and stakeholders, establishing processes through which individuals and businesses may meet their tax obligations and receive benefits, and carrying out compliance activities to help ensure that everyone respects the law as intended by Parliament. With respect to the taxation of artists, the amount received by an artist may generally be taxed as either income from business, income from property, income from employment, or other income. The tax treatment of a particular amount depends on the nature of the amount received, the circumstances under which the amounts are received, and whether the artist is an employee or is self-employed. Many factors must be considered in determining whether an individual is an employee or is self-employed. Essentially, the question to be decided is whether the contract between the parties is a contract of service that exists between an employer and an employee, or is a contract for services, that is, the engagement of a self-employed individual. A contract of service generally exists if the person for whom the services are performed has the right to control the amount, the nature, and the management of the work to be done, and the manner of doing it. A contract for services exists when a person is engaged to achieve a defined objective and is given all the freedom required to attain the desired result. If it is determined that the artist is an employee, generally amounts received by the artist will be taxed as income from employment. Artists who are employees have a limited amount of expenses they may deduct from employment income, such as traveling expenses, motor vehicle expenses, and musical instrument costs. Where an artist is determined to be self-employed, they are generally considered to be operating a business. When an artist receives financial assistance in the course of operating a business, the amount is included in the calculation of their business income. Generally, expenses incurred to earn business income are deductible provided the expenses are reasonable, not personal or living expenses, not on account of capital, and not made for the purpose of gaining or producing exempt income. An example of a deductible expense would be an agent's commission. Art production grants that are neither business nor employment income are included in an artist's income as other income. However, the art production grant exemption may allow the artist to reduce the amount included in income by the reasonable expenses incurred to fulfill the conditions of each grant, such as the cost of materials. The exemption cannot exceed the amount of the grants. In instances where the exemption is less than the amount of the grants, an artist may be entitled to reduce the amount of the grants included in income by up to an additional $500. Through its liaison officer service, the CRA offers free virtual support and guidance by video conference or phone to small businesses and self-employed individuals. To align with the CRA's People First approach, the liaison officer service helps small business owners and self-employed individuals understand their tax obligations and helps them to avoid common errors that could end up costing them time and money. Over the past 2 years, during the tax filing season, liaison officers have provided seminars to members of the Canadian Artists Representation. The information provided was tailored towards artists and writers and included information regarding deductible expenses, how to correctly report information on CRA's COVID-19 benefit programs and the CRA's online services, and key information about tax filing season. These seminars have been well received, and we intend to continue offering similar sessions in the future. With that, I'm again pleased to answer any questions the committee may have regarding the general taxation of artists.
Thank you very much. And with 10 seconds to spare, we will now go into our first set of questioning, and this is the 6-minute round. And the first round is Ms. Thomas from the Conservatives for 6 minutes. The floor is yours.
Thank you, and welcome to both of the witnesses that are here with us today. As you know, the topic of discussion at hand is the well-being of Canadian artists, and more formally, it has to do with their financial well-being. And so I'm really proud of the diversity that exists among Canadian artists across this country. They are definitely coming up with some really great work, and for sure, as other witnesses have stated, we are very much enjoying that, and they did play a key role.
Rappel au règlement, Monsieur le Président.
We missed.
Point of order, Mr. Chair. Yes, Mr. Champoux. Interpretation has been interrupted. Has Ms. Thomas' headset been properly selected? It sounds like her sound is being picked up by her her device.
Is the microphone plugged in or appropriately selected?
Yeah, I apologize, Chair. I think I have it set up now.
Pour l'interprète, est-ce que ça fonctionne maintenant?
For the interpreters, is that working?
A little bit longer.
Sure, I don't mind chatting a little bit longer. Chair, perhaps you could confirm for me that this isn't eating into the time that's been allotted for me to speak and that I will in fact have an entire 5 minutes. Or 6 minutes, I guess.
6 minutes, yes. Ms. Thomas, you are, and interpretation is indicating that it is now working. So I will restart the clock and the floor is yours.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Chair, and I apologize to the committee. I just started out by just welcoming the witnesses and, of course, thanking you for the good work that you're doing. Thank you for giving us your time today, and, of course, just acknowledging the good work that artists have done, not only to keep us entertained throughout the pandemic, but long, long before, and, of course, contributing to the arts and culture here within Canada. There's a great variety of artists, and I think those voices deserve to be celebrated across this country, no matter their platform or the artistic expression of their choosing. Now, we've heard from a variety of artists here at this committee, but I don't want to assume that either of you have listened to the different discussions that have gone on here. Darcy Michael is a comedian and he's a digital first creator. He offered some really interesting comments that spurred a few questions for me. And so again, coming back to the fact that you probably haven't listened to all of the testimony that has been shared here, I would like to just read a quote of his from his time. And then I do have a question for you, Mr. Ballou. So Mr. Michael said this, and I quote, "Some of you might not be aware of this, but for some reason that no one has ever been able to explain to me, comedy is not a recognized art form in Canada. As comedy is not recognized as an art form, unlike musicians, actors, dancers, and writers, comedians are not eligible for grants in Canada, which meant that the pandemic left no options to help me or my family. So I pivoted. I decided to take the concept of my sitcom to digital platforms like TikTok and Instagram, particularly to entertain myself during those early dark days of the pandemic, but also because I wanted to prove the concept of the show, not in hopes of networks changing their minds, but because I'm bitter and I wanted to prove them wrong. I did. Fast forward to today. 18 months after first joining TikTok across all social media platforms, I have 3 million followers. Our TikTok channel alone averages 40 million to 60 million views a month. For the first time in my career, I'm reaching Canadian households that I could have only dreamed about before. Not only that, I own 100% of my content. I'm 100% in creative control, and I keep 100% of my profits. With platforms like YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram, artists can be in control of their creations, their content, and their businesses. Of course, networks and record labels are crying foul because they can no longer take advantage of the starving artist. Being a content creator online has single-handedly been the best decision I've ever made. Before pivoting to being a digital creator, I was making ends meet as an artist, but just barely. He goes on to say, not only has our success benefited us financially, but by my working directly with Canadian brands across our social media platforms, in just the last 12 months, we've helped put over $500,000 in sales back into the Canadian economy. That's from one channel on TikTok. He further goes on to say, Bill C-11 will directly affect my ability to earn an income. I just think that we need to make an amendment to that one portion of the bill. I don't want to be included. I don't want to be paying 30% to something that I don't benefit from as a digital creator. I think that's a second tax. I think by the end of the day, I'll be paying 80% tax on my income. That isn't fair, end quote. Mr. Ballou, you commented on the taxation scheme within Canada and how greater benefit might be afforded to artists. I didn't hear any specific mention to digital artists. And I do believe that they need to be considered because, of course, they fit within the grand framework of Canadian artistry in this country. We've heard from many artists who have achieved by pivoting to these creative platforms. They already pay an income tax, of course, from their income as an individual. And now they're concerned that there's going to be an additional 30% that they'll have to pay with Bill C-11 passing, which causes them to fall under the CRTC and then, of course, have to contribute to the art fund. And so my question for you is, would a 30% tax on top of the income tax that they already pay help digital first creators to better earn a living?
Monsieur Beaulieu, vous avez la parole.
Mr. Beaulieu, the floor is yours.
Désolé, j'ai comme mal entendu.
I beg your pardon. I didn't hear what the chair was saying. Pardon me. So to help artists, certainly to better help digital artists, certainly the possibility of averaging the income they make over a number of years would be helpful, because this would also average.
If I may, I'll just clarify my question. So if digital artists are forced to pay 30% off the top of their revenue into the arts fund, will that benefit them in terms of their overall income as an individual and their well-being?
Oui, Monsieur Beaulieu.
Oui, merci, monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the question, Ms. Thomas. So yes, this redistribution would be deductible under the Income Tax Act, because they would be allowed that revenue, but that is quite a high percentage of their revenue, of their income rather, that would have to be contributed to that fund. However, this is a deductible contribution, so they would be able to deduct their taxable income of what they contribute. So certainly that redistribution I wasn't necessarily aware that it was that high an amount, but it certainly would be a deductible amount, and it wouldn't be taxed. So that means that it would be an expense for them, but it would be tax-free.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much.
Round of questioning will go to Mr. Housefather from the Liberals. And Mr. Housefather, you have 6 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. I do want to just give my own opinion, which are that comedians are included in the membership organizations that are certified to bargain on behalf of artists, such as ACTRA or the Union des Artistes. And I think the 30% imposed on digital creators is simply a conjecture of my colleague, and I don't think, in my view, that's founded based on what's in the bill. So let me now move to the topic at hand. First of all, j'apprécie énormément.
I certainly appreciate your presence here today, Mr. Dimitrokopoulos and Mr. Beaulieu. My first question.
Can you talk to me about what federal tax deductions are available to artists? Maybe just list them.
And before you do so, Mr. Dimitrokopoulos, if you could just maybe move your microphone just a little bit up. I think it's came down a bit, so we'll try that. And if there's any changes, interpretation, will flag it for me.
Sure. Thank you very much. In terms of the deductions for artists that are self-employed, there are a number of them, and I'll list them. So just go to self-employed artists. Here's a list. First of all, insurance premiums on musical instruments and equipment, the cost of repairs to equipment, including the costs of new reeds, strings, pads, and accessories, legal and accounting fees, union dues and professional membership dues, an agent's or mandatary's commission, remuneration paid to a substitute or assistant, the cost of makeup and hairstyling required for public appearances, publicity expenses consisting generally of the cost of having photographs taken and sent with a descriptive commentary to producers, presenters, and the media, and including the cost of advertisements in publications, transportation expenses related to an engagement in a situation where the engagement is out of town, in which case board and lodging would also be allowed. A large instrument or equipment must be carried to the engagement, dress clothes that must be worn from a residence to the place of engagement, or one engagement follows another so closely in time that a car or taxi is the only means by which the engagement can be fulfilled. The cost of filming and recording performances where required for their preparation or presentation. Telephone.
Is the list much longer, Mr. Dimitrakopoulos?
I've gone through about half of it.
Okay, but I think that we've gotten a flavor of it, but there's a fulsome list that is included. I'm going to ask this to both of you, but I'll ask separate questions. Could you, and briefly, Mr. Dimitrakopoulos, could you talk to me about what tax measures specific to artists exist in other jurisdictions in Canada that are not included in the federal, that are not included federally? Meaning, are there more favorable tax measures in Quebec than there are federally in terms of the provincial treatment? More deductions, different ways to treat.
Thank you very much for the question. I'm not as familiar with deductions in other jurisdictions. I am aware that Quebec has a type of income averaging that has been set up, but I'm not in a position, or it's not within my mandate to speak about whether something is better or worse. That would be a tax policy question.
Yeah, no, I'm not asking you better or worse. I was asking you the distinction, but I understand. Thank you so much. Peut-être je peux me poser cette question.
Perhaps I can put this question to Mr. Beaulieu. Mr. Beaulieu, you have surely dealt with taxes for individuals in Quebec and across Canada. Could you talk to me about the differences? Are there certain parts that are better at the federal level or better in Quebec? And what lessons should we learn from the taxation carried out in Quebec for the Federal Act? Answer. Well, in Quebec, there are a number of measures that should be harmonized into CRA. For example, income averaging for artists, which is an extremely important measure that makes it possible to spread out exceptionally high income over a number of years. There's also a deduction for all income from copyright. So artists can apply for a deduction, which will reduce their taxation on that type of income. So those are examples of measures that would be very much appreciated if they were to apply across the country for artists working to showcase our culture. Thank you.
Time left, or am I done?
You have about 28 seconds.
I'll just say I appreciate the witnesses both being here, and thank you so much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Housefather. And Monsieur Champoux, c'est à ton tour.
Mr. Champoux, it is your turn for 6 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Dimitrakopoulos and Mr. Beaulieu, for being with us today to enlighten us. Mr. Beaulieu, at the beginning of your opening statement, you said that the status of the Artists Act was questioned by the CRA. I almost fell off my chair. Then Mr. Dimitrakopoulos specified that artists are seen as small enterprises at the federal level. So if I'm understanding, there is no special consideration given to artists by the CRA. Is that true?
Si je peux me permettre, Monsieur Champoux.
If I may, Mr. Champoux. Yes. I think there is a misunderstanding of artistic practice as it pertains to taxes, because artists are certainly professional. And especially at the beginning of an artist's career, the artist will invest significantly in their training, and they will have a number of expenses that are not necessarily covered. For example, producing a series that will be shown during another tax year that's not necessarily the same tax year as the expense. So artists have operating costs that can be recurring. And often, this raises questions when it comes to taxing. Mr. Champoux, I'm interrupting you. I'm sorry for that, but I have another question that just comes to mind. So you spoke a number of times of income averaging. I think that's a measure that would be extremely beneficial to Quebec artists. That is very beneficial to Quebec artists. ACTRA was a witness and said that averaging over 4 years is an option that could be very worthwhile. And it was in place until 1989 for artists. Number one, is it a good idea to consider that option rather than tax or income averaging? And which of these two options, if they were both maintained, works better, and are they compatible? Answer. Well, as it works in Quebec, income can be spread over up to 7 years, so that is quite a long period. So, for example, someone who creates a film, and that takes 2 years, well, the income that comes from this film can be spread out over the other years, and this means that that artist's income level can be a set level. It can be a shared out. And when we see Quebec artists, we know that this is a measure that could be incorporated into CRA. It would be beneficial to other Canadian artists because we see that it does help Quebec artists out when it comes to taxing. Question. At the federal level, if 4 years was the time frame selected, but if 7 years remained the period in Quebec, would this be too difficult for artists? Would this pose problems for artists when they declare their income? Answer. Yes, I think that if the terms are different, then not the same rules are being applied. And especially if we remember that their knowledge of taxing is not necessarily, they're not specialized, then we can conclude that, yes, having two different systems could create confusion in taxing. Question. You said something else, and I was completely shocked earlier. You're talking about grants for a project that lasts longer than a year. The expenses are taxed. Is that true? Yes, absolutely. Perhaps 3 or 4 years ago, the Canada Council for the Arts, which appeared just before me, allowed artists to spread out their grant depending on the length of the project that they had the grant for. So say if they had a $40,000 grant, they were allowed to use $10,000 for 1 year and $30,000 for the second year. Question. Yes, but an artist can also ask to be given the grant all at once. But then, even if they asked for it, then maybe the people they were dealing with didn't deliver on time, and then their time frame was skewed. And just to conclude, because I have just about a minute left, right, Mr. Chair? You were talking about arts in Quebec and the business numbers, and how it would be great that the same rules apply in Canada as in Quebec. Can you speak to how artists are affected? Answer. So for all types of arts, whether they're digital arts or other, having municipal buildings or federal buildings include in their budget art, a part of the budget for art, would help showcase culture, whether it's at a local courthouse or other. It would be a very important measure. Thank you very much, Mr. Beaulieu. Yes, thank you.
Julian, next round is to you for 6 minutes. The floor is yours.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for your testimony today. and we hope that you are safe and healthy in this sixth wave of the pandemic that is currently hitting Canada.
To start, Mr. Dimitrakopoulos, with you, and thank you for your presentation. I'm wondering if you can provide to the committee, either now or later, figures from the last completed tax year, that would be 2020, on the total value of grants that were declared by artists and the total value of the grant exemption that were provided by all artists.
Thank you very much for the question. I don't have those figures offhand, but I can get that information for you.
Okay, thank you. And my next question may be the same result, and that is you've been very careful, and thank you for that, to explain to us the definition between contract of services and contract for services, an employee or the self-employed. Now, does Revenue Canada actually keep statistically the number of artists that file income tax returns and the percentage of those who file under contract of services, in other words, are considered employees, and those that are considered self-employed?
Thank you very much for that question. Once again, I don't have the statistics, but I will try to get them for you.
Does Revenue Canada, and this has been a problem systematically in other sectors. For example, one example that hits me is people with disabilities across this country. If you file with revenue from a provincial disability program, you're actually not treated differently in CRA, which became a major problem when we were looking at pandemic relief and supports going to people with disabilities. Most people with disabilities aren't even counted in the CRA system. Are artists tagged in the CRA database so that we know who they are and can identify the answers to these kinds of questions?
Thank you very much for the question. For certain deductions that go to artists, that would be the CRA would know that. But in terms of all artists and whether they're tagged or not, I do not know. I will have to get back to you on that.
That would be very helpful, because we've seen this in other areas where the CRA systems have been deficient. So it would be helpful for us to know that. My next question is around, and you were very helpful in response to the question from Mr. Housefather of talking about the series of exemptions or credits that apply to artists, everything from instruments and equipment to makeup and photos. Do you have, and can you provide to the committee, the total value of those for the tax year 2020, or the most recent tax year where you have those figures available?
I do not have those figures available, but I will do my best to get them for you if they're available.
Okay, that would be helpful as well, for the same reason that the other questions are helpful for our report, to really get a sense of how the tax system works now. Now, this is a more sensitive subject that I'm going to bring up, and that's compliance activities. As you're probably aware, the NDP has been very critical of the lack of compliance activities with the ultra-rich in this country. The Parliamentary Budgetary Officer evaluates the annual loss because of that refusal to comply for the ultra-rich of $25 billion a year in tax dollars that go to overseas tax havens, for example. You did talk specifically about compliance activities for artists, and I would like to know more about how CRA ensures compliance by artists, even though, and quite frankly, many have been critical of the agency, of this refusal to push the ultra-rich in this country to comply with the similar tax system. Can you give us a sense of what that means in terms of compliance, the number of audits that are conducted on artists, and penalties that apply to artists over the last few years, over the last tax year?
Thank you for the question. I do not have the data in terms of the number of audits and the value of the audits. What I can say is that as the administrator, we try to carry out our compliance activities in order to help ensure that everyone, including artists, respects the law as intended by Parliament. And what we have tried to do is, as an administrator, help artists by for instance, over the past 2 years during tax filing season, have liaison officer service that offers a free virtual support and guidance, either by video conference or phone or a webinar, to small businesses and self-employed individuals, including artists, to help them understand their tax obligations and help them to avoid common errors that would end up costing them both time and money. And over the past couple of years, during tax filing season, liaison officers have provided seminars to members of the Canadian Artist Representation. And the information was tailored towards artists and writers and included information regarding their deductible expenses, how to correctly report income as self-employed individuals, as well as information on COVID-19 benefit programs and CRA's online services, and key information about tax filing. And
I do have to stop you there, Mr. Dimitri Kopoulos. We are running short on time, but maybe there might be a little bit of time left. If the committee is okay, we'll do a lightning round here. 3 minutes, 3 minutes, 2 minutes, and 2 minutes. 10 minutes for Mr. Shampoo. But we'll start with Mr. Lewis for 3 minutes or less.
I was thinking, is it the other side first, or I'm okay with going?
You're 100% right, Mr. Lewis. I appreciate your honesty. Mr. Waugh, you have 3 minutes.
Well, thank you, Chair. Just a question to the CRA, because our office is inundated every tax season on the interpretation. And some, when you talk to CRA representatives, they have a different interpretation than others. And I know you're doing the webinars and so on, but is that a problem when you talk about a specialized area that we have right now in artists, where, you know, we have Mr. Boileau on, and he seems to be very adverse to the artist sector, but I can tell you there would be more that would not understand the artist sector, and then, you know, deduction-wise, it's all based on interpretation. So, Costa, I would like you to address that, if you don't mind, to the committee.
Sure. Thank you very much for the question. Over the past few years, other than the liaison officer service, we've also tried to consolidate information concerning artists and writers, and we've put out what we call an income tax folio for artists and writers that consolidates information about their tax obligations and the various deductions that are available and the various rules that affect artists and writers. And we try to update that folio when there are changes in the legislation, or if there are new positions taken. So we hope that by doing that, people can find a repository of information in one place that represents CRA's views on artists and writers and the taxation of artists and writers.
Mr. Boileau, as an individual, a CPA, you must see people fall through the cracks, because you seem to me very professional in this aspect of the CRA, I would say 95% of others in this country would not share your interest. And I can see many artists would not get their full credit in this country because of it. Could you address that, Philippe?
Oui, merci pour votre question.
Yes, thank you for your question. The arts sector is often not well known by many accountants because oftentimes accountants work with small medium enterprises whose needs are completely different than those of professional artists. Professional artists have unique types of income. And as my colleague from the CRA mentioned, there are specific types of deductibles for artists that are very important. When I have a CRA liaison officer call me, I refer them to that folio that was mentioned so that we can talk about the reality of artists and the deductibles they have available to them. So I work with different artist centers in Quebec in order to help artists become more knowledgeable about taxation because they're working in a very specific milieu. And there is a lot of confusion. Not everyone knows this well.
Oui, merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Mr. Beaulieu. Excuse me, but we're about to begin our second round with Mr. Lewis for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to both the witnesses. I appreciate you being here and I appreciate your expertise. Mr. Dimitrakopoulos, maybe I'd start with you. You know, we've heard this today, we've heard it before, that it's common for artists to spend years working on projects and then only getting paid once it's released. And because artists and performers see fluctuations in their activities from year to year, we were talking about this today, they are eligible for carry forward allowable expenses. Which allows artists to deduct travel, promotional expenses to lower tax liability. But I would like to know if more can be done. You know, it still poses a greater tax burden on individuals whose income is irregular and fluctuate from year to year over people who have a steadier income. So can you tell this committee if that idea of income averaging has been something that you have researched?
Thank you very much for the question. I'm aware of the question of income averaging, but I would respectfully submit that the question being asked is outside the scope of the mandate of the CRA. We deal with the implementation of the Income Tax Act as is, and that the Department of Finance would be in the best position to respond to your question, as the Department of Finance is responsible for developing and evaluating federal tax policy and amending the Income Tax Act.
Okay, no problem there. Maybe I could ask this way: are there any other sectors in our economy in Canada that do use income averaging?
Thank you for the question. I'm not aware of a particular other segment that does income averaging.
I wasn't aware myself, so I just wanted to clear that up. Maybe if I could then ask Monsieur Beaulieu, there are different types of income averaging. I've looked into block averaging, general income averaging, general forwarding averaging. Which one is Quebec looking into, and do you have, as an expert on taxes for artists, do you have a preference?
Avoir la possibilité de pouvoir répartir.
Having the option to spread out exceptionally high income over up to 7 years, because in that case, artists are able to choose the length of time that they prefer, and they'll be able to spread out their exceptionally high income over the most years possible. And this, in turn, will allow them to have a stable fixed income rate over those years. And this allows them to be guaranteed a certain amount of income, which will be paid to them for each of those years in question. So this would be an exceptional measure if it were built into the CRA and incorporated for artists across the country. It is an exceptionally good measure to allow artists to have money coming in because their projects are so variable from year to year. And this helps them to have more stable income. Thank you very much. Mr. Champoux, for 2 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So we're studying the Federal Status of the Artist Act, which has been in place for decades. And the artistic community and stakeholders are exercising pressure to change it. In 1991, we saw that there was a review of the difficulties in the arts sector. After that, a committee was set up, the Applebaum-Hébert Committee, which was supposed to look into this Status of the Artist Act and to look into policies in Canada. The commissioners found that in spite of what they had heard from the artists, the artistic community and the exceptional contribution to Canadian society, that there would be no changes. In later years, another body was set up, and Paul Siren and Grace Gélina also proposed a number of amendments to the Income Tax Act to provide more financial stability, which Mr. Beaulieu mentioned one of those measures. And then another body created the Subcommittee of Culture to review the prior reports regarding the status of the artist. And then in 1990, a report was tabled, and then the committee set about instating the Status of the Artist Act. And finally, in 1992, we saw the current act be born, which still needs to be reviewed. Today we are finishing up our study, and quite frankly, I am concerned because we will be submitting recommendations to the government which might not be listened to, and this bill may remain without enough teeth. In 1992, it was said that many, if not all, of these professionals can be considered as highly specialized poor artists. Mr. Chair, I worry that this will remain to be the same, and our artists deserve better. Thank you very much, Mr. Champoux. Mr. Julian, you have the last turn for about 2 minutes. Thank you very much. Yes, we undertook this study to help encourage progress for the situation of artists across the country. And what did we see during our sittings? We saw that artists are not receiving assistance to the point where it could be making a difference for them, and that other countries have been doing more.
Study after having numerous witnesses tell us how difficult it is to be an artist in Canada today, and many institutions admitting as well the difficulty of the artist's life, given that this is so extremely important for our cultural future in our country. It means that the government needs to take this seriously and needs to start making the changes that other countries have to actually provide for a solid basis for artists in this country. And so I'm certainly hoping that we will see that difference, that shift in how the government actually looks to supporting our artists. It is absolutely fundamental. Maintenant que j'ai quelques secondes pour...
Now that I have a few seconds to ask some questions, I have a question for Mr. Beaulieu. So everything that we heard from the CRA and the supports that they have for artists, in your opinion, is it enough? Is the framework in place at the CRA sufficient to support our artists? Thank you for that question. The CRA could put in place further measures. For example, could introduce new measures to further support artists, for example, on income averaging and copyright deductibles that could be extended to all Canadian artists. These are measures that are very important for Quebec artists, and Revenue Quebec can make a difference to their yearly income this way.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Beaulieu. Thank you very much. Mr. Dimitrikopoulos. We much appreciated your comments today.
Today on this important study. If there's nothing further for the good of the committee, we will adjourn. Adjourn.